ag educator in Jennings County. And then Simon Kafari will be closing us out tonight, and he's an ag educator in Clark County, Indiana. But again, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and stop my video, and then I'll just start sharing my screen. And what we wanted to start with tonight, just show you how the title of our program is Reap What You Sow, and kind of a practical guide to successful gardening. And as I just said, Robert Waller, who's ag educator in Jennings County, myself here in Scott County, and Simon Kafari are our three presenters tonight. And basically we figured we needed to start where we're at right now, here on Wednesday, June 22nd, which is basically in the middle of our gardening or growing season. So we do plan to cover with this presentation those things listed there: diseases, insects, management of fertilizer, supplemental irrigation, succession planting and growing late into the season, do cover crop planting, soil testing, and soil amendments, and then moving into the spring and planting for next year. We're going to move through this as fastly as we can, but we anticipate about an hour and a half total with some questions at the end. I have this slide as just kind of a ground rules, if you would, just courtesy ground rules for everyone that we have. As I said, have your lines muted as you came in during the presentation, just to avoid that extra noise, because we figured some folks would be coming in after we started. And we'd like them to remain muted during the presentation, and then we'll not take any questions via mics during the presentation, but you can submit them using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom. Then at the end, if we have time and folks want to unmute their mic and submit them audio questions then, or do more in the chat. But again, we hope to have time to do all that. I'm sure many of you have been on Zooms lately during all this pandemic, but for those that haven't, again, we have muted you when you come in, but you can see beside your picture the microphone there and where you can unmute it if necessary later. Put your questions down in the bottom at the chat. You can either do it as a full screen or a gallery view or speaker view. I would like to caution you that you may need to stop your video though, in particular if you notice that audio is lagging, maybe having some low bandwidth, maybe some weather moving through, that kind of thing. But be assured that this event is being recorded. All three of us presenters are doing it, so hopefully we're going to get it recorded at the end. And I've already said we have speakers. Robert's going to go first, I'm second, and then Simon. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert here, again, ag educator in Jennings County. And as I stop sharing my video, then it'll be, I should say each of us are going to do sharing our own videos. So that's why we wanted to be able to keep everyone muted. And then we can each take it over and do our part of the presentation. So Robert, take her away.
All right, thanks, Tom. Am I sharing correctly?
Yes, you are. It looks good.
Okay. As Tom said, my name is Robert Waller. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Jennings County in Southern Indiana. And I'm going to jump right in and start talking about some common problems in gardens. And let's see. Well, for some reason my slide is not advancing. There we go. So common garden pest diseases and abiotic problems. First step in the control of these diseases and pests is to accurately identify the problem. It's important because different environmental, mechanical, mineral deficiencies can mimic the pest and disease problems that you'll see in the garden. So you want to distinguish between these different types of effects that you're going to see on the plants. If you can study the life cycle of common plant diseases and pests, you can use this information to avoid the stages of the pest and disease life cycle that are going to cause the most damage. After you've properly identified your problem, you want to choose an appropriate control strategy. So there may or may not be one control method. There could be multiple methods. We'll go through kind of a lot of different strategies you can employ to help control this. You want to be able to use the most cost-effective and environmentally friendly strategy available to you. If you have to resort to using chemical control, we strongly recommend avoiding using synthetic chemicals. And we'll go through a lot of the options on the botanical and biorational control methods as well. So first off, we talk about pest disease, abiotic problems. One of the abiotic problems, meaning it's not a living organism, is nutrient deficiencies. And so a lot of times you can see these problems and think you might have a disease, but really what you need to do is make sure you have the right nutrients in place. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or N, P, and K, those are the major nutrients that all plants need. They need those in larger quantities. If you see a nitrogen deficiency, if you have too little nitrogen, it's going to have a very distinctive overall yellowing of the entire leaf. It will start in the lower plant and kind of move up through the canopy of that plant. Potassium deficiencies, you'll see a darkening around the edge of the leaves. A potassium, or the K, which is a chemical symbol for potassium, you'll see kind of a yellowing around the edge of the leaves. Magnesium deficiencies will have yellowing between the veins of the leaves. We'll talk about calcium deficiencies with a problem a little bit later on, but you can see a lot of these show up as some general yellowing, discoloring of the leaves. So they can actually mimic some of the particularly disease problems you'll see. So one thing, we want to make sure that we are correctly identifying this. So there's a danger of misidentification. So is it an environment, is it a disease, is it an insect pest? We need to know, what's causing the problem. If you look across some of these pictures here, the ones that have the same numbers behind them, they tend to kind of mimic each other. But just look at the first two pictures. You see some spider mite damage on bean plants. If you could see some wind or physical damage that may look very similar to that. You want to make sure you're checking to make sure the spider mites are on the underside of the leaf causing that. If you move across to the right, you see a bacterial leaf blight of beans. The first leaf is just kind of a general yellowing. You might think that there's a nitrogen. That's what the N behind that. You may say, hey, I have a nitrogen problem. But as the disease progresses, you can actually see dead parts of the leaves showing up, those necrotic or brown spots in there. The leaf is actually dying from that disease. So you want to make sure that you can distinguish between these sort of mimicking reactions that the plants can have. So this kind of a busy slide, a lot of pictures on here, but it's just going through some of the common garden pest and disease problems. We'll kind of dive into these a little bit more detail in the following slides, but this kind of gives you an overview. So a lot of the common diseases that we'll encounter in southern Indiana and the surrounding areas, most of them are going to be fungal infections that are going to be attacking your plants. We can have some bacterial interactions, some bacterial diseases coming in, and a few can be viruses and some other problems that will show up. So one very common disease, particularly in tomatoes, but it can attack other plants as well. It's called early blight. This is caused by a fungus named Alternaria. And it's a very characteristic disease symptoms on the leaves and on the fruits of the plant. It shows up kind of as a dark grayish, blackish spot. It'll have concentric rings. It'll look kind of like a little target spot on that leaf and on the fruit. So that's very distinctive of early blight. Late blight really affects tomatoes and potatoes, but it can also affect other plants as well, but this is the main. If you have heard anything about the Irish potato famine, that was a late blight of potatoes and was caused by Phytophthora infestans. So a very common disease problem that we see a lot of. Another one is blossom end rot. Now, this one is more indicative of a calcium deficiency. So a lot of times this can be caused, it starts at the end of the plant or the end of the fruit, and kind of works its way into it. So away from where it's attached, still attached to the plant. If you have uneven watering, if it's too wet, too dry, you're not giving it adequate water at appropriate times, you can see this develop on the plants. It can also be, indicative of a nutrient deficiency of calcium or some other imbalance in your soil, too much salt and other things like that. Downy mildew attacks the leaves. It shows up as yellow spots on the leaf. As it progresses, you can actually flip the leaf over and you can see a little bit of the mycelium growing out of the bottom side of that leaf. Probably one of the most common diseases out there is powdery mildew. It's very prominent on cucurbits, which are all your squashes, yellow squash, zucchinis, a lot of melons, watermelons, cantaloupes, honeydews. It will attack many other plants as well. It basically looks like somebody kind of sprinkled some baby powder on top of the leaf. Fusarium and verticillium wilt, so will infect through the roots of the plants and will cause damage to the stems, roots that basically chokes out the plant, and it will cause plant death. You can have some nematode problems. Root knot nematodes, very problematic on tomatoes and potatoes. These are microscopic worms that live in the soil, and they basically burrow into the root and suck nutrients and water out of the root system. One anecdotal thing is people do plant marigolds as a trap for nematodes. Septoria leaf spot, another fungal disease. This actually comes from being splashed from the soil surface, and it'll start in the lower canopy and work its way up as the disease progresses. Damping off, typically a problem early in the season, but again, Tom will cover some succession plantings. If you're coming in with some late season plants, you want to watch for this. And it starts at the soil line, and the stems will start to kind of rot away. They'll look water soaked, they'll be mushy, and this can be caused by Phytophthora, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium. Many fungal organisms can cause this damping off at the soil surface. Going through some more common vegetable diseases, particularly in tomatoes. Gray mold is a very problematic disease. It shows up on the leaves, the stems, and the fruits. A very distinctive gray color to it. Pretty kind of starts out as circular splotches on the leaves and the fruits and spreads out, can cause a lot of damage. Leaf spots, we talked about septoria and other leaf spots. It'll usually start at the lower canopy, move up through. There are rusts that attack, and they have kind of a rust or brownish, orangish brown color to them. Again, this is another fungal disease that you can flip the leaves over, and in those lesions, you can actually see some of the fungus growing out of the bottom. And they usually kind of is more of a roughish on the leaf. You can kind of feel these. Bacterial blight can affect the leaves and stems of plants. A bacterial leaf streak basically goes through the leaf. It kind of forms this distinctive streaking disease, very common in onions. There's a bulb rot caused by bacteria in the onions as well. There's a tip dieback. This shows a picture of the bacterial tip dieback. There's another fungal disease called anthracnose that can cause similar symptoms. Essentially, exactly what it says, the plants will die from the tip back. And bacterial wilt of onions too. You can see this very distinctive wilting of the top leaves of the onions. It's a very characteristic show of that. Next, we'll transition into some insects. Most of these cause the damage in the larval stage, which is either a nymph or a worm of these insects. Some of these will cause damage at both the larval and adult stage, and the adults generally are causing damage with the sucking, piercing mouth parts or chewing mouth parts, where they're actually eating the leaves off of the plants. So a lot of common insects that you'll see a lot of, aphids, they'll attack the underside of the leaves. These bugs they're very small. They're typically yellow, green, or you can have a blackish appearance too because they secrete a honeydew substance that can develop some mold growing on it as well. You can also see ants like to colonize these because they like that honeydew piece. So that could be something that's symptomatic of seeing aphids. Armyworms can be very destructive. Just as the name implies, they are voracious feeders. They will eat just about anything, any kind of plant that they can get a hold of. Earwigs can cause some chewing damage as well. Flea beetles, they can be a problem. What's very characteristic of these smaller insects is that they can do a lot of leaf etching. They can chew all the way through the leaf, but if you see some of that etching that you can see here where they're just kind of eating the top part of the leaf as they start, that's very symptomatic of the flea beetle feeding. The vegetable bugs, or this is showing actually a picture of a green stink bug, and we'll see a brown marmorated one later on. They have sucking, piercing mouth parts, and they cause damage on the plants and the fruits as well. Mealybugs. A lot of people see these mealybugs, and the first thing they think about is that looks like a fungus. That looks like, it's sort of white, fluffy type stuff, and you think there's a fungal disease, but these are actually insects, and they usually congregate on the stems, particularly where branches come off of the plants. Scales kind of act the same way, a little bit smaller insect. They can do a lot of damage to the stems and leaves of the plants. Spider mites typically are a big problem when it's hot and dry. Usually when we have wetter conditions, they're not as big a problem, but they will feed on the underside of the leaves as well. They're very small, typically kind of a yellowish type insect. And then squash bugs can be a very big problem, obviously in squash, but also on pumpkins and melons and a lot of members of the cucurbit family. Some more insects to be on the lookout for. Cabbage loopers and other caterpillars are very prominent, and they do a lot of feeding damage on both the leaves and the fruits and vegetables. Cabbage worm is a very damaging pest as well. Sorry about that. Tomato hornworm is a very distinctive looking worm as well. As you can see, it's very showy, and that's another big problem on tomatoes. It can also affect other vegetables as well. Leafhoppers can be problematic, not only from the feeding on the plants, but they can also transmit viral diseases, so you want to be on the lookout for those. A leaf miner does just that. It mines the leaf. So if you see this type of symptom on there, you're having a problem with leaf miners. There's the picture of the mealybugs again. There's a lot of different kind of weevils. This is a pea weevil. They have very distinctive little kind of horn-like antennas on them. Pepper maggots can be a problem in a lot of the peppers and other types of crops like that, like tomatoes and others. And then asparagus beetle is another one to keep an eye on if you're growing some asparagus. There's a lot of insects that you may need to look a little harder for. One of those is the squash vine borer. So if you see a problem with squash or other cucurbit plants and you don't see any diseases on it, but the plants are looking like they're wilting, you may need to check some of the stems. They'll be inside the stems, so if the stems are hollowed out, you may need to split some open to see if they're feeding inside. The carrot rust fly, the larval stage, will do some damage to your carrots. Colorado potato beetle feeds on the leaves of potato plants and others. Cutworms are more of a problem early in the season, and they do exactly that. They'll cut the plant off at the soil surface. There's the brown marmorated stink bug. Again, the piercing, sucking mouth parts do a lot of damage to the plants as well as the vegetables and fruits. Thrips can also cause damage through their sucking, piercing mouthparts, and they can also transmit viral diseases as well. Another problem that you could have that's soil related, so if you see problems with your plants and you don't see anything above ground, you may need to look for wireworms. And the wireworms are the larval form of click beetles, so those elongated beetles that make a distinctive clicking sound when they fly away. So you may need to dig into the soil to see if you have any problems with wireworms. They feed on the roots. We see another picture of a bean leaf beetle. They do a lot of damage, not only on the leaves, but also on the bean pods. And then sweet potato weevil, another type of weevil that's going to cause some problems in your garden. So now we're going to talk about some common controls. Recommendation is to use the chemicals as a last resort. This pyramid here kind of goes through some strategies you can employ starting at the bottom. You work with prevention, then you go into cultural and sanitation practices, some physical and mechanical barriers, biological control, and then, like I said, the chemical control kind of as a last resort. So if you have tolerable limits of damage, the first recommendation is to do nothing, but you still need to monitor that. A lot of plants can withstand about a third of the leaf being damaged or eaten away, but you want to make sure it doesn't progress beyond that. Prevention can come in with resistant varieties, create a non-conducive environment for diseases. You want to avoid the stages of the pests that may cause the damage and plant alternative host plants for these different pests. Cultural practices can include using crop rotation. The plant spacing, you want to make sure that the plants are spaced out. You don't want to create a good environment for fungal diseases to thrive in. Companion crops, I talked about marigolds earlier. They have a lot of repellent type properties. There can be some other companion plantings as well. You want to make sure that you've cleaned up the debris, old plant material, anything that falls off the plant. You want to get that out of your garden because it can harbor particularly fungal diseases as well as other insects. Get rid of the weeds. This time of year, you don't want to necessarily pull them up because you might damage your crop that's growing. But you want to get those out, maybe cut them off below the soil surface. Weeds can also be hosts for a lot of these insects and diseases. So you want to make sure you have a nice clean garden plot. So again, we're looking at the chemicals as the last resort. So exclusion is another, it's a physical type. You can have barriers, you can have row covers, ditches, fences. You can use repellents. I talked about the marigolds earlier. There's snail and slug wires to keep those out. Those can be very problematic and sometimes hard to control. And then mechanical, you can talk about traps, sticky traps, doing the weed control, taking those out mechanically. And you can even get these little vacuuming units that can suck the insects off the plants. And then biological control. This is using natural enemies of these pests to control them. These include parasites, predators, pathogens. There's parasitic wasps that actually lay their eggs on worms. And as the eggs develop and the larvae start to grow, they basically just feed on the worm and kill it. The lady beetle, the larvae, is a very good predator, particularly for smaller things like the aphids and the thrips. So that can be used very effectively as well. So again, avoiding these the chemical control as much as possible, you're going to maintain your beneficial insect population. Like I mentioned, the ladybugs, there's parasitic wasps, lacewings. There's a thing called assassin bugs, which just do that. They kill other bugs. Damsel bugs do the same thing. And then also your pollinators. You're going to have a lot of flies and bees, things like that that are going to help pollinate your crops. So you want to make sure you're protecting those when you're trying to get rid of the other insect pests. So as we look at some of the first line defenses, you want to try and use these non-synthetic products. Biorational and botanical insecticides. These are basically things that are formulations that are just come from either the earth or from plants. Some of the examples of this is the kaolin white clay. It's like a physical poison to insects. There's contact poisons. Pyrethrum is one. It's actually extracted from plants in the daisy family. So it's a very effective control for a lot of insects. There's stomach poisons, the BT products. You may have seen these. One that I'm very familiar with, I put a picture on here, these mosquito ducks. They help control mosquitoes in standing water. There's also BT liquids you can apply. This actually comes from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. It produces a toxin that is very specific to killing these pests, particularly the worms that feed on the plants. You can also use some volatile compounds. These could be anything like cinnamon, garlic, different kinds of oils, different mints, different things like that. These not only work to keep a lot of insects away, they're very good about animals. We didn't really talk much about animals, but they're good at keeping animals from destroying your garden as well. Some other things that you can employ, there's oils, soaps, and other botanical pesticides. These are very safe to use in the garden. They're not only safe for the beneficial insects and pollinators, they're safe for you. So that's why we're really stressing these. Neem oil is one of the most prominent products. There's a lot of different brands that have that. Neem oil is effective on insects as well as being very good, particularly on powdery mildew. It's one of the go-to products I've heard a lot of people talk about for powdery mildew. And as I mentioned, that's a very common disease. Insecticidal soaps, Serenade, AQ10, these are some other products that can be used that are going to be very safe. Now we're going to transition to fertilizing. So you want to fertilize based on soil test results, and Tom will talk about this a little bit more later on. But you want to amend your soils. If your soil test comes back low or basically says you need some fertilizer, you want to put about half of that recommendation and kind of work it into the soil. Till it in about 6, 7, 8 inches down. The other half you put on the top and kind of rake it in. You want to evenly distribute that fertility in the rooting zone of your plants. You want it to be there when the plants are young, but you also want it to be there when the plants are growing and a lot larger. So if your test comes back and says, hey, everything seems fine, that doesn't mean you don't have to fertilize later on, because your plants are going to be taking up those nutrients. You want to do a maintenance application. So you want to have a balanced fertilizer with your NPK, your main nutrients that your plants are going to need. And there's a lot of formulations for these. They come in a lot of different analysis that tells you how much of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in there. Some of them are evenly balanced, 12, 12, 12. I've seen a lot of 10, 10, 10s. Some of them are a little more distributed. So you may need to think about the crops you're growing and the nutrient needs. Also, it's very important to read the labels on these products and apply the right amount at the right time. You don't want to over apply your fertilizer. This is a case where more is not better. You want to make sure you get the right amount on so you're not burning the plants, burning the roots, and doing more damage than good. Again, a little more on fertilizers. If you're starting some new things later in the season, you can use starter fertilizer. These starter fertilizers are typically water soluble. They also have a higher P content. So your NPK, they're higher in phosphorus. You're going to be much higher. That middle number in the analysis on that is going to be much higher than the first and third number. So that phosphorus is very good for using as a starter. Again, you want to make sure you're using the correct rate on the plants. You can come back later on and do a side dress with nitrogen. So nitrogen is the biggest need for most plants. You want to make sure the plant has a lot of growth to it, or it maybe starts into flowering. So if you get it a little bit too early, you can delay that fruiting, you can reduce the flower, you may reduce yields. Young plants can't take too much nitrogen. It's going to burn the roots and cause more damage than good again. So again, we're stressing you want to avoid some chemical fertilizer, use organic fertilizers whenever you can. Some good examples of these for nitrogen sources. There's plant byproducts made from alfalfa, corn, gluten, cottonseed, soybean meals, animal byproducts, manure. Dried blood is actually a good source of nitrogen. Feather meal, fish emulsion, bat guano. So these are all good organic solutions to bring in added nitrogen to your garden. So some organic sources for phosphorus, bone meal. It's a very good source. All of these are, for the phosphorus, are kind of a slow release, so it'll slowly release it through the growing season. Potassium sources are listed here. Kind of an interesting one. The first one, Sulpo Mag, that actually is going to bring in sulfur and magnesium that the plants also need. That's more of a rapid release. Some of the other products you can read through there. If you're going to use wood ashes, a little bit of caution there. It's a high pH. You don't want to do too much of that because you might alter the pH of your soil system, and then that's going to alter nutrient availability as well. So now I'll transition to watering. All plants need adequate water throughout their entire growth period. You want to supplement the rain, so you really only want to apply it when it's needed. And you want to apply the water slowly, and you want that water to soak in and really get into the rooting zone. Mulch is good to use to conserve water. It also moderates the soil temperature. We've had some very high temperatures so lately, as you all know. It also helps with weed control. And you want to apply the water to the soil. You don't want to put it over the top of the plants, and water early in the day if you can. You're looking to apply about 1 to 1.5 inches per week in a single watering. You want to maintain about 6 inches of wet soil. So you want to get that water down through the root zone. Roots will tend to form near the surface of the groundwater if it doesn't penetrate deeper. And shallow rooted plants can have lots of problems. One of them is susceptibility to drought. They're also going to be susceptible to physical damage. So if a windstorm comes in, the plants aren't going to be anchored, and they'll tend to fall over very easily. If you have any potted plants, they should be watered daily or every other day, depending on the size of the pot and the temperature outside. But just make sure you're monitoring. So you don't want to overwater. You don't want to saturate these soils. You want to make sure your pots are draining as well. So some other tips for watering: you can get very creative and put some supplemental water systems in. If you're going to have a permanent garden site, you may think about sucker hoses, drip tapes, drip irrigation systems. These can be set up on timers. Again, you want to monitor your rains, and you don't want to overwater. So if you have that on a timer and you get some really good rains, you may want to turn that off until you actually need to apply the water. You can also do some rain water collection systems, and the state of Indiana actually encourages this. You can use a gravity feed system. You see a simple system that's set up there. You want to make sure you use dark colored containers and keep it out of the sunlight, because you don't want to have a little incubator for algae and fungus to grow in that. You need to monitor them, make sure they're emptied out and cleaned on a regular basis. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Springston. He's the A&R Extension Educator in Scott County. So take it away, Tom.
All right, Robert, thank you. I know there's a lot of information in there, but again, just want to remind everyone that we are recording this, so you will be able to go back in and look at that and jot down more things that you forgot. I'm going to begin with talking about gardening techniques to extend the season. One of those things is interplanting. That's where you're going to plant alternate rows with a late and an early maturing crop. So when you harvest the early crop, then you have space created for the late crop. An example would be like planting rows of cabbage, onions between the rows of radishes or lettuce, and then when you harvest it, it creates space for that cabbage or onions to grow. Another technique is called intercropping. And with intercropping, you have a late and early maturing crops are mixed on the same bed or in the same row. So as you harvest that early maturing crop, then it creates space for that later maturing crop. An example would be like lettuces and cabbages planted together. You see in this bottom right picture. This chart will show you a couple more times, so don't worry about trying to record all it, but we're just talking about succession planting. And the idea being that as soon as one crop is finished, you want to plant another one. So when you plant a cool season crop like lettuce, spinach, radish, and so on, harvest them, you can put in some beans, beets, and turnips. here we need to worry about when is our first freeze or frost dates. So this chart is like by what vegetable, you know, and then for our area, we're around that October 10th, 15th, maybe into 20th. So you could look down to see, okay, I still want to do some peas, so I still have them in early August to be able to do that. I'm going to, next few slides here are going to be a lot of publications and links to them. And you know, it wouldn't be an extension presentation, right, without a lot of links to other publications. Again, this will be recorded, so that's how you'll be able to go to them. As I click on this first one, I'll just tell you this once. It's talking about when you're opening it, you know, some files can contain viruses or otherwise be harmful to your computer. So it's important to be certain that it's trustworthy source. So I'm going to say yes, because I have viewed all these. I have put these in. I see I need to close my screen because I didn't close it out in the beginning. But we have, first up, we have a lot of the Farmer's Almanac. So you'll see here indexes, and you'll see where it'll, a lot of topics. This one is a 21-page publication, so you may not want to just spit that out, particularly on your color printer right about now. Again, I just closed that, so whenever I open these others, then they'll all come up, okay? This one is, again, another Farmer's Almanac. That's on how to keep the garden growing, like maybe into the season. It's not as big of a pub. It still is 15 pages, you'll see up here, but it's very good index. And actually, whenever you go to click on it here, since it's a web, it brings you up to a different topic each time, whichever one you would click on. So a lot of great information. And again, I apologize, I'm scrolling here fast, but these links will all be in our recording. This one is on a succession gardening. Again, it's another Farmer's Almanac, which is really a very good source if you haven't gotten it. Again, this publication, we will show this chart, I should say, in a different publication that will give you more information about when to be planting and how late. This is another one to the Farmer's Almanac. It's just on planting. Gives good guides. So you want to pick this on sweet corn. I want to know more about it. So you just click on it, and it takes you right there to that, and it tells you all about growing sweet corn, when to plant them, how deep, how much water they need, that type of thing. Last one here from the Farmer's Almanac. It is on this succession planting that we were just talking about. Just tells you about how to get this fresh supply, you know, really what is the succession planting, different methods of what they talk about doing it staggered or in a row, that type of thing. And last one on this page, we're going to talk about some Indiana vegetable planting calendar. I like it as someone refers to this as really our Bible, if you would. I should have said under most of these, where they come up, you can click up here and enlarge it more, where you can see, you know, here's all the different topics. This is actually a chart on the average frost dates in the spring. This is one average frost dates in the fall. So like where many of us are here in Clark or Scott or up into Jennings County, we're into this, the category of the G, you know, that October 16th to 25th. And when you scroll on through, here's all the listing. You know, these are for those planted in the spring. This is the one where you plant them in the fall, and here area G, it tells you. You know, when you need to be planting them to have enough days to get them to grow before that fall frost date comes. So another gardening technique to extend the season is using vertical training. As most of you or some of y'all probably know, peas, beans, cucumbers, squash, melons, even tomatoes, they're naturally wanting to climb. So if you give them something there to support that, they're going to climb. And then that allows the later maturing crop for to be grown in that same space. Oops, I clicked a little too soon there. Then the other thing is with dwarf or mini plants. Often they are early maturing, but they still often have a great number of fruit produced. and so you're going to have a good total harvest. Gives different types, whether it's a tomato, pepper, eggplant, some of them having dwarf or mini plant varieties. Quite often they can be used to start your gardening indoors, and then you plant them early in the fall and harvested before that frost sets in. Another technique is companion planting, where we're planting multiple crops in the same space to mimic or imitate a diversity of the natural ecosystem. This is good for mixing your dual season crops with the cold season crop early in the spring. Like an onion is a dual season crop. So after you harvest it, or the spring crop, then you still have time for it to grow and harvest it later. It's good for planting your late summer crop and your fall crop together. Another benefit, I guess, is where the plants are mixed. Insect pests spend a great deal of time moving from plant to plant looking for the right one instead of just sitting there and eating all that. So that's a good benefit. Back to some more of the websites. Once you've grown it all and harvest and storage of your fruits of your labor is really what you're probably interested in. So here's another Purdue publication on the charts for when you want to plant and harvest your fall vegetable garden. As these come up, again, you can enlarge them and make it. If you're getting like me, you need bigger print anymore. And again, I apologize, I'm quickly scrolling through these, but just giving you some more of that, different charts of when, how you want to do something for frost protection, that type of thing. This is a one-page handout on information and on storing and cleaning your fresh vegetables to make sure we're not passing along any foodborne illnesses. It's just a one-pager, but it has a lot of good information, like you pick your vegetable, what method you're going to be storing it. You need to just rub it with your fingers or scrub it with a brush. So like just pick cucumbers here as an example. You can store it in a cool place, preferred, but it can be refrigerated. You do want to scrub it because you want to rinse and scrub well to remove that waxy surface before you do store it. And then this publication is on storing fruits and vegetables at home. Again, many of you are probably familiar with a lot of our Purdue publications. And if you don't have a home basement where it's a good place to store it, it talks about doing pits, having a tile storage where you can access it like through November to May. I started to say on a lot of the publications that if you're just searching for information, I always like to tell folks, if you're going to do a Google search, put .edu in that, and that brings up all the educational universities. And those is what we usually refer to, those would be a research-based instead of just the .coms that are trying to sell you things. But just quickly, a few more of those publications. This one's on freezing and how that can be a quick and easy method to preserve foods in the home. And I think this one is really good, and it just talks about how to be successful. Do you need to blanch this vegetable before you do? Ice crystals forming, is that good or bad? Well, they say it's really desirable because it's going to preserve the texture of that. So again, different tips on packing those vegetables whenever you do freeze them. This one's handling tips and recommendations if you want to just store it in the cupboard, the refrigerator, or the freezer. It's only, it's a 15-page, I should say. Major thing is, how long can I store? And then you put in the answer before its quality deteriorates or it's no longer safe to eat. This publication actually rolls to the side here on us instead of scrolling up and down. But again, a lot of good information in there. And the last one on this page is the basics of canning. Sure been seeing a lot of pictures on Facebook and talking to neighbors and all that. A lot of green beans are coming in now. They're doing a lot of that. You do need to pay attention. Is this a low acid food or a high acid food? Am I going to do a boiling water or a hot pack or a raw pack? Again, if you don't know that information or need a refresher, these are great sources. And something that we don't do or haven't tried at home, but it's on storing dry fruit like dehydration. Yeah, another great publication that just talks about that. And this will be our last link we'll click on. We wanted to point out that many of our coworkers in the health and human sciences, or the HHS extension educators, many of them provide classes on these topics we just talked about. You may say, I don't know who my HHS educator is. So here's the link to the Purdue Health and Human Sciences Extension Educator webpage. This little PSA kind of tells, well, what is an HHS educator. Here's the link over here that you just click on. Say I'm going to put in Clark as the county, and we're going to go to that. And it's going to bring up Marilyn Sink. She's Simon's coworker there in Clark County. So again, a lot of information here, I realize, but it will be in the recording of how you can go back and find that. So I'm going to kind of move into planting cover crops and planning for next year. We do need to prepare or till our garden. It's usually done in the fall or early spring when the soil is workable. So for any of you that have been doing much gardening for long, you'll know this, or maybe you learned it quite well, in that you do not want to turn your soil when it is wet, because it's just going to remain hard and lumpy the whole rest of the season. And then once you do till, you want to keep your soil disturbance to a minimum, because you're just going to be bringing up more weed seeds. It's always good practice if you have compost in your garden or a compost bin nearby, end of the season, put that in, till that into the soil. It's just going to help with the health of the soil and adding to the till. So after you turn the soil, use some plastic mulch or other type of mulch to reduce weeds. And then particularly in the springtime, black plastic will help speed up the warming of the soil. I'm a big proponent or a promoter of using cover crops at the end of the season when possible. And a good cover crop like a winter rye, buckwheat, hairy vetch, or even a winter wheat, it just provides some cover over winter time. Maybe you're on a little bit of a slope, you don't want any soil erosion to start. And then next spring, whenever you till that under or later, then you're going to have a lot of good nitrogen and other sources and adding to the health of the soil. So basically talking about how healthy is your soil, or how do you find out? Well, you need to do a soil test. And that's going to tell you whether you can adequately support some plant life, if it needs to be healthy, if you need to add some nutrients, what nutrients you already have, what's maybe sufficient or limited quantities, I should say, and then whether it's available. A soil probe, like you see in this picture here, or an auger, might be a nice fancy way to do it. Not a lot of people have them. Many of the extension offices have them that they could loan out to you, but just using a sharp spade over here, make a little hole, or a long knife or a trowel would work. You just want to make sure you're removing about the same amount of soil from each of those sampling areas that you do. You only need to do this about every 3 to 5 years is adequate. Usually doing that in the fall or in the autumn, so you'll have plenty of time to get the results back and then get prepared for next spring. You want to do random sampling and down to a depth of about 6 inches. And if you have dissimilar parts of the yard or the garden area, like here it shows, here's a bottomland picture, and this is more of an upland or on the hill. You'd want to keep them separate because there's probably going to have different pH levels or nutrient levels. The X's represent the amount of samples you'd want to take. And the more samples that you can take, mixing them all together, you're going to have a better result than if you just go out there and you take 1 or 2 in that sample area. Basic test is going to come back showing the organic matter, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, the cation exchange capacity, and what the pH and the buffer pH is of the soil. So knowing all that helps to know how healthy your soil is going to be and if it can manage be able to supply what you need to. You want to try to remove that organic matter, or say that grass, if this was a new area that hadn't been tilled before or anything. But proper handling is really the most important thing, so you're going to have accurate results. And I put in here, collect samples in a plastic bucket. Don't use a metal bucket because it can potentially flake off and contaminate your sample, come back as high nutrients that aren't there. Don't let your samples touch anything that would contaminate them, like the floor of the truck or your vehicle. What you do after you come back with that sample in the plastic bucket, you just take a nice clean newspaper, a couple layers maybe, depending on how wet your sample is. Spread the samples uniformly over that. Just let it air dry. Don't put it in direct sunlight or don't put it in the oven to dry it. But after it's air dried, then you want to mix it all together. You may even have to crush it here to get some of those bigger lumps mixed up. But you're only going to need about 2 cups. You put that in a Ziploc bag. If you have multiple bags, you want to label them right afterwards so you be sure not to get them mixed up. So I'm about done to my part. That if it talks about needing to amend the soil, you could either choose it to take it to the extension office to help them to know what you need to add, or you can do it yourself. But the 2 main things you're probably going to want to see and worry about is pH. So if that pH is above 7, if you want to reduce that alkalinity and get it below, and you could use elemental sulfur. But most cases around here, we need to, they are too acidic, and we need to reduce the acidity. That is, they're already below a pH of 7. Ag lime is what you would want to use to do that. As Robert mentioned, you could do wood ash, but the maximum amount that you'd want to put on would be 2 pounds per 100 square feet. Because if you put anything on higher, you're going to have too much of this potassium and interfere with it, and the plant being able to uptake the magnesium and the calcium. So this is my last slide. I just put in here. It's not fancy with pictures, but just to remind some of you probably may know, a ton is 2,000 pounds. An acre is 43,560 square feet. So if you come back with a fertilizer, a soil sample that maybe comes back and says they recommend a ton of ag lime to the acre, I've already done the conversion here to tell you that 1 ton per acre is 4.59 pounds per 100 square feet. So if you just kind of round it, the 4.59 pounds, you're approximately putting on 5 pounds to 100 square feet of your garden. Now, there's not too many people have an acre garden. If you do, great, and put on what it recommends, but maybe just you get that smaller amount and put it to that 100 square feet. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Simon Kafari, our coworker, who's an ag educator down in Clark County. So Simon, take her away.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to make sure that I'm sharing.
Yeah, if you'll hit it into presentation mode, Simon, we see your slides and
okay,
presentation, and you'll be ready to go.
There
you go.
Is that okay?
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, thanks again, Tom. As Tom said, I'm Simon Kafari, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Extension Educator here in Clark County. What I'll be talking on to finish up the evening is, what plans you put in place looking ahead to next year. The first thing, and I think is very important, especially if you're a beginner, is to put together a garden plan. It is very important, although a lot of people say, I have a small garden, why will I need to put together a garden plan? Putting together a garden plan will help you determine the lay of your garden right from the onset. When and where you have to put raised beds, containers, vertical gardens, especially if space is an issue with you. If you don't have large space, those type of planning at the beginning of the season is very important before you start. You also list the crops, varieties or plants that you want to grow. That again is very important for you to start thinking of in terms of space, nutrient requirements, and things like that. You decide on a rotation plan and plant location. That is also very important. You decide right from the onset with a plan on a rotation plan. That helps you determine which areas to put what families of vegetables, and how the rotation will take place later in the years. You determine your input requirements. What do you need? Where do you find it? And how much of it do you need? And what time to get it? You also need to decide whether you are growing early, late, or full season crops. And especially those who are going to raise their own nurseries at home, it's important for you to determine what time you want to transplant, so that you determine the time you begin your nursery to coincide with the time you want to transplant. The planning process is just not a one-time event. It is an iterative process that you do over and over again till you are sure that you actually have what it takes to succeed. So when you have done your planning, the next thing is to be thinking of where to get your seed. Of course, we all know where to get our seed, but very quickly, I will want to go through some of the places that you can get your seeds from. One of the things I always tell people who come to my gardening classes is that a lot of these catalogs and seed packets have very beautiful pictures. Some of them will even show pictures of high-yielding varieties that you bring and put in your garden, and you don't get the same yield. So don't be carried away by the beautiful pictures, and don't be carried away by the marketing lingo, because what they are trying to do is sell their seed. What you need to do first is to know your climate, your growing zone. Here in Clark County, our growing zone is 6A and 6B. Be sure that you know where your growing zone is. Look at the seed and see whether it can grow in your climate. The next is to be thinking of the soil type that you have in your garden. If your soil is clay and it's likely to be waterlogging, it's not every vegetable that can grow in your soil. So to have an idea of what the physical, chemical, and biological properties are, as Tom mentioned earlier on, some of the soil tests that you do will help you with that information. You also need to know the growing conditions for the crop. Study a little bit, or go online and Google, and as Tom said, go to university websites and find out what the growing requirements are for the vegetables that you are going to grow. You may also need to start seeds indoors. So read and be sure that the seed is not going to be started indoor if you don't plan putting up a nursery. And as we always emphasize, please read catalogs and the information on catalogs and seed packets, because they have a lot of information that can help you in your gardening. So the next is, where do you get these seed? Again, we all know where to get the seed from, but very quickly you can get the seed from certified seed dealers locally, such as Walmart, Home Depot, and even the small mom and pop nurseries. You can get your seed from them. You can also order through catalogs. You can get your seed from seed swap programs. And if you have a seed swap program or club in your county, please join, because they normally have very unique seeds that you can benefit from, apart from the fact that you exchange ideas as to how to grow those vegetables. Another thing which can be fun is to process your own vegetables at home. And I'll go through that in a bit. So if you decide to process seed from home, there are certain basic tips that I want you to go away with. First, you should know how to extract the seed, whether the seed is dry or wet. If it is dry seed, very often you have to be very careful not to crack the seed, or else if you crack the seed, it may not germinate. It's also very important, especially for wet seed, to know whether your seed is mature and can germinate. In the case of dry seed, once the placenta gets detached from the pod and you shake it, you can hear it rattle. You know that it's about time the seed is ready. Or if it is sweet corn, you look at the what they call a black layer, and that is a layer between the seed and the cob. But at times, wet seed extraction can be tricky because you wouldn't be sure of when the seed is fully mature and the seed is ready to be harvested. Again, you can get some of that information online. So make sure that you don't extract your wet seed too early. Cleaning dry and wet seed is also very important. You have to know how to clean, especially very tiny seeds like those that come from onions. What is always I see very common around here is people extract wet seed and they put it on the hand papers or the kitchen paper that absorbs a lot of liquid. What normally happens is if you dry your seed on that kind of paper, it sticks to the paper and it is very difficult to remove later on. So you either use a ceramic plate or a glossy piece of paper on which you dry the seed. And even after drying, when you put your seed in a jar, please add silica gel so you can have a lot more of the moisture extracted before you then start thinking of pelletizing if that is what you want to do. Seed selection is a lot easier with dry seed, but you also have to know the full size dry seed, because if you take a full size dry seed that is small and not fully developed, it may still germinate, but the problem you will have is that the cotyledon will be too small to be able to support the seedling in the early stages. So you have to know a good full-size seed, how it looks like, and be able to select the right seed for storage. When it comes to wet seed, there are so many ways of selecting wet seed. The most popular is what they call density separation. And density separation is just very simple. You take a solution and put in a glass, as you see on the screen, and you extract your wet seed and put it in the solution. All the seed that floats is not good for storage. You throw that away, and the seed that goes to the bottom is the one that is going to be viable. When you have finished selecting your seed, you've dried your seed, the next thing is to be thinking of treating the seed before you store. Most often, treatment of the seed is done with just fungicide. But should you want to treat the seed with bactericide or for virus, what you do is that you treat for bacteria and virus first before you then treat for fungal infection. Storage, when it comes to keeping seed, storage is really very important. You need to store your seed within a certain temperature range. Very often 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower is the best temperature to store your seed, and a relative humidity of between 20 to 25%. Be careful because you could have decay and mold. So you have to watch out to ensure that your relative humidity is between 20 and 25%. I'm just very quickly going to go through a little bit on seed fermentation, because this process, although it is not required in all situations, it is a very useful process for some seed. Seed fermentation is often done to remove germination inhibiting substances from the seed coat. It is also to improve the ease of germination in some seed, and it also helps to enable seed easily imbibe, that is, this absorb water. The germination process starts with the seed imbibing or absorbing water before it then goes through the germination process. Fermentation can help with that. And fermentation also helps to reduce or control seed-borne diseases. So very quickly, a fermentation process is just that's simple. You mash your fruit, and you add half or to 1 part of water. It is important for the temperature to be between 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and let it sit for 2 to 5 days. Now, in order to determine that the seed has been fermented, you start seeing some white, mycelia or material on top of the water. That indicates that the seed is fermented. Remember that it's not all seed that needs fermentation. So again, when you are extracting seed from home, you will have to read to ensure that you are fermenting the right seed. Tomato needs fermentation, but if you don't go take it through the fermentation process, it will still germinate, except that it probably doesn't germinate as quickly as if you were to ferment it. And if seed needs fermentation, if seed is not fermented, it could delay. As I said, germination will delay, but most often you will still have most of the seed germinating without fermentation. What I will caution here is be careful not to over ferment your seed, or else you have sprouting taking place. And once the seed sprouts, it is not going to germinate later on. Seeds that commonly sprout belong to the squash family and the Solanaceae or egg tomato family. So watch out for such seeds to avoid sprouting. So let's talk a bit about managing the home nursery. So should you decide to start a home nursery, one of the first things you need obviously is soil. Please avoid the use of garden soil. Use premix or soilless mix. You can also make your own soil at home using garden soil, but make sure that you add about 30% of peat moss and vermiculite to make a good soil for starting your nursery. Before you use soil or even the containers that you use for the nursery, please make sure that you sterilize and disinfect all the tools, the place you are going to be working, the tables you are going to be using to work, as well as the containers. You sterilize to about 160 degrees or up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And what you do is, as you can see in the picture there, you pinch a hole at the top of the foil and put a thermometer through it. Make sure that the thermometer is not touching the base or the bottom part of the container, or else you'll be reading the temperature directly on the container, not in the soil. And once the temperature reaches between 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, it means your soil has been disinfected enough. Anytime I'm teaching this class, I tell my participants that one of the ways that my grandmother used to disinfect her soil, because she didn't have a thermometer, is to put a potato in the middle of the soil and put it in the oven. Once the potato is cooked, it means the soil has been disinfected or sterilized. And disinfecting your containers, you can use any of the common kitchen disinfectants that you have. Just make sure that after you have disinfected, you start the nursery immediately. Don't wait and contaminate the containers again. Now, once your seedlings are getting ready and they are in the kitchen or wherever you place them, it is important for you to observe certain management requirements in order to ensure that you get good seedlings. First is germination. The best temperatures for germination is between 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relative humidity of 65 to 75%. What I normally do when I'm raising seedlings at home is that as soon as I plant the seed and I water, I put the seed in a plastic container and tie it up so that the humidity inside the plastic container will keep the seed bed up to the same level of relative humidity that is required. What you have to do if you are going to do that is to be very careful and be watching out. As soon as the seed starts popping up, that is, it starts to germinate, you remove the plastic bag, because if you don't, then you raise the problem of getting into diseases such as damping off. When you are managing the seedlings, be mindful of temperatures as well. Night temperatures of between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit are adequate, and day temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit are adequate for managing your nursery at home. And as I said, watch out for damping off, because it is the most common disease in seedlings that can really devastate your seedlings. And avoid seedlings that grow spindly like what you see on the screen. Some of it is normally because you don't provide the seedlings with enough light. But in some cases, people, as I mentioned earlier on, you have to know when you are going to transplant in order to time your seedlings to meet the transplanting date. Some people realize that their seedlings are ready and they are not yet ready to transplant, and they start playing tricks with them, and in the end they end up getting spindly seedlings. Spindly seedlings, even if they survive out on the field, have a very difficult time to establish, and they don't produce a lot of fruits. Once you have gotten your nursery ready and you see your first 2 true leaves, what you do is you apply fertilizer solution. You dissolve 1 tablespoonful of fertilizer in a gallon of water. You use high phosphorus fertilizer, and examples are what I have here, but you can use any other type of fertilizer with similar quantities of the P. P is a number in the middle, and it should be quite high because that is what you want to start with. Be careful, because during the seedling stage, if you use fertilizer solution and you apply too much, you kill all your plants. So be very, very careful. One other thing that you need to know before you send your plants out is conditioning of the seedlings indoor. One of the first things that will help you speed up your seedlings growth is what they call pricking out. And the bottom middle picture you see is an individual pricking out seedlings. Most often it's very difficult to space out seedlings when you are first putting the seed into the box. So they come out as crowded as you can see on the picture. And what you then do is you prick out using either a pen, a sharp stick, and you gently just dig your seedlings out and space them out between 1/2 inch to 2 inches, depending on the type of vegetable, so that they have more room to grow. There's more aeration, and they have more room to be able to take in more nutrients and grow very quickly for you to transfer them to the field. But of course, I also know that most of you will prefer to go and buy your seedlings from places like Home Depot and Walmart. Should you decide to do that, there are a few tips that I want to leave you with. Make sure that you buy seedlings that have short, stocky, and healthy stems. And the stem is about the diameter of a pencil, and they should look dark green. The leaves should be dark green as well as the stems. Please avoid seedlings that have spots on them or they look yellow. That simply tells you that these seedlings were not properly cared for in the nursery, and you will have a very difficult start if you buy those seedlings, so avoid them. And very often you'll see people selling seedlings, especially tomato and pepper, and you have a lot of flowers on them. What happens is some of the nursery owners realize that it's getting too late to sell these seedlings. So again, they play some tricks and try to delay the growth of the seedlings. But the seedlings, the inside clock of the plant is such that you cannot delay the reproductive phase. So the plant will transition to a reproductive phase, and that is why you see a lot of flowers. So if you see seedlings with a lot of flowers, please don't buy them. If you have just 1 or 2 flowers, that may still be okay. What you do is pinch off the flowers before you transplant. If you are buying a grafted plant and you are going to use a grafted plant, one thing you should note is that ensure you remove the suckers below the graft union, and the suckers just very close to the graft union. Even for plants that are not grafted, the very early suckers, you remove them in order to encourage vegetative growth upwards and not lateral growth early in the life of the plant. Best time to transplant is just before sundown, and what you do is you dig a hole about twice the size of the soil ball that contains your seedling. and you set the plant about the same level that the plant was growing in the pot. It is important for you to do so for most seedlings, except for a few vegetables, that varieties that you can't grow or plant beyond the ground surface. And one of those is tomato. If your tomato happens to be very leggy, you can still plant at an angle. In fact, even if your tomato plant is not leggy, it is always recommended that you plant your tomato at an angle and allow 1 or 2 additional nodes to get into the ground. Those additional nodes will start producing roots. And the more roots that you have, the healthier the plant will be, because it's able to get more water, it's able to get more nutrients. So once you have put your plant in the soil, you should firm loosely around the plant and apply a starter solution, which is a soluble fertilizer high in phosphorus. You apply by dissolving one tablespoon of high phosphorus fertilizer in a gallon of water, and apply not on the stem, but around the plant. And once you have finished transplanting in the evening, and the reason why you transplant in the evening is to minimize the heat that will impact your vegetable. What I normally do is that I also protect the vegetable for a few days. I cut a small branch of the tree in my house, and then I insert the branch with the leaves next to the vegetable, so that it is protected from the leaves of the branch, from wind and excessive heat. And you leave it on there for about 2 to 3 days before you remove it. I want to touch a little bit on transplanting in degradable pots, because what we very often hear is that if you are transplanting in peat pots or peat pellets, you don't need to be worried about removing the container. That may be true, especially for peat pellets, but it is not true for peat pots for a number of reasons. First is that if you plant in a peat pot, yes, it will degrade, it will get rotten, but what happens is that the roots will stay around the bottom of the pot, and they'll be going, the root will be swelling around the bottom and not be able to come out. And that, by the time the pot gets rotten, it will have delayed the ability of the roots to go out there into the soil looking for nutrients and water. So the best is to break open the bottom part of your peat pot, as you can see in the picture. One other thing too is the peat pots will normally have the seedlings with an edge, above the soil level, as you can see in the picture bottom right. What you need to do is cut off that extended edge, because that extended edge, if you transplant and it is showing up above the ground, it serves as a wick. It will just be drawing away all the water around your plant, and that can impact the roots of your plants, and in some cases can even kill the plant. One rule of thumb is that mulch all vegetables you transplant, and please stick them as soon as you mulch. As soon as you transplant, please mulch and stick them at the same time. Just to quickly conclude what my colleagues and I have been saying for an hour and a half or so, this is a time of year that is most critical for gardeners to look out for pest and disease management, as well as supplemental watering if they have to succeed. What is key is to monitor and make sure that you are able to diagnose the problem correctly to be able to appropriately fix your problem. If you are tackling pest and disease problems, the best and the most economic, the most economic and healthy way is to employ more than one non-chemical control approach. If you have to use chemicals to control your pests and diseases, please start with non-synthetic chemicals. The success of any garden depends on how much you put into it. You reap what you sow. Start with a garden plan and revisit the plan several times to be sure that it aligns with what your objective is. Do a soil test, and make sure that, you know, when you are interested in extending the garden, you adopt appropriate cropping practices as suggested by Tom. Make use of your knowledge of crop environment pest relationship, and you should also do things to mimic a conducive environment for your plants if you plan to extend your garden. While all this is going on in July and August, you also be thinking ahead to next year. So you'll be thinking of how to process your own seed if that is what you want to do. So you learn the basics of how to extract your own seed. The requirements for nursery management so that you can have a healthy seedlings. What to look out for should you decide to buy plants from a nursery. And also read around the best agronomic practices to use in your garden. And a lot of those were mentioned by both Tom and Robert. So before I let you go, just quickly, we'll want to announce that we still have upcoming programs. There are 3 more series in this program series. And the first will be, the next will be in July, on July 29th, and to be on farm finances and succession planning. Kyle Weaver will be the person presenting on that. Then August 5th, we'll have 4 lawn care tips, which will be presented by Jeff Hamish. And August 12th, we'll have pond management class, and Dave Osborne is going to team up with Aquatic Control, and they will be presenting live from a pond site. So please register to participate in those classes. As Tom already mentioned, the talk today is being recorded and to be available later on. We really appreciate your participation this evening. We know you could have been somewhere else and you decided to come to this presentation, so we really appreciate it. Thank you and have a good evening.
All right, thank you, Simon, very much. Whenever Simon does his unsharing, then we'll come back to where I've got a tile view to see everybody's pictures there. I know a JG looked like just joined us here right at the end, but to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. And after we end it here in a bit, then within the next couple of days, that should be sent out to you, or to everyone, I should say, to link to where you could access that. I was watching the chat and I really didn't see any questions for any of us, but if anyone would like to unmute their mics now and ask any questions of Robert or myself or Simon, we'll entertain any questions anyone might have.
Tom, there's a question, I think, in the chat box now.
Are there any pest/disease diagnosing help publications online that you all would use? Or I didn't see the use, maybe I should say recommend. There we go. I guess, Christine, what I had tried to mention in mine was that a lot of times if I'll Google a question or something, I'll just put, say, cucumber disease control. And in fact, I did that today. And then I'll put a .edu in that. And that brings up first, it would bring up those universities or research publications that they would have on it. And then that's how I would go with those recommendations before scrolling on down through the list to see the .coms or the chemical companies wanting to sell you something, that kind of thing. So I don't know if Robert or Simon wanted to add anything else, but I guess that's what I look online at many of those publications. Sure, we have a few of them in our repertoire or in our files, but a lot of those will change and get updated. So
that's a very good approach, Tom. I agree with that. A lot of the extension sites will have publications with pictures They can also recommend some control measures as well, but I think the diagnosing piece of it is the first step to make sure you're going to implement the right control strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one other way is to download apps that have been created by the universities. For instance, we have what they call the Tomato Doctor app that has been put together by created by Purdue University. We have other apps similar to that can help you with your diagnosis. So you use the app and it walks you through, and eventually once you put in the requirements that you are looking for, it will tell you what the problem is.
Good question. Anybody else with anything? So thanks, Christine. She said it's very helpful, and thank you all. Anyone else have any questions? And again, you can unmute your microphone now. Just saying to JG that came in a bit later, we were having everyone muted as they first come in, so we didn't have any background noise. But now would be the point if someone wants to put a question down in the chat or unmute your microphone and just ask it either way. All righty. Well, not seeing anything else in the chat or hearing any questions, I'll just say to Robert and Simon, I'm going to stop my recording now, and we're sure glad that everyone has joined us, and we'll get that recording out to everyone as soon as possible.